Welcome. I'm Glenn Anderson with the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation. For more than 25 years, this TV series has explored a wide variety of issues that relate to peace, social justice, economic justice, and nonviolent social change. During this hour, we will explore some of the problems with prisons and sentencing. We'll also propose solutions to those problems. I'm happy to welcome two guests who have done a lot of highly competent work, very conscientiously and effectively in addressing those issues. We have Carol Estes. She is a co-founder of a nonprofit organization, University Beyond Bars. University Beyond Bars provides much-needed post-secondary educational classes to prisoners so they can improve themselves while incarcerated and succeed in life when they're released. Good to have you here, Carol.
Thank you. Good to be here.
And Stephen Aldrich lobbies for a statewide Quaker-based organization, the Friends Committee on Washington Public Policy. This organization works for humane and effective laws regarding the criminal justice system, other social issues, and the state budget. Welcome, Stephen. Good to have you here.
Thank you.
We will get a lot of good information out to the viewers during this show, and I think we'll have a pretty good time. I've enjoyed doing the preparations with you. Let's start by just recognizing that we have way too many people coming out of prison and ending back in prison again. Prisons consume an enormous part of every state's budget, and in most states, the prisons are run by an agency called the Department of Corrections or something like that, and yet you have to wonder, do they correct anything since so many people come out without having been corrected? They end up back in prison again. And taxpayers should be asking what we're getting for our money. What can you tell us, either of you, about the recidivism rate, people who commit crimes after having already served their sentences?
Well, I can tell you that it runs around 40%. 40% of the people who are released commit new crimes and end up coming back to prison. So it's a pretty impressive failure rate for our system.
And I guess the one thing that I've noticed is that it's going down, that we seem to be finding things that work, although we have a long ways to go. But there's not as much recidivism as there once was. And hopefully it will continue to go down as we become more evidence-based in the approaches we take to modify the system as opposed to more emotionally based reactive interventions of the past.
So when you talk about evidence-based, you're saying that's research into finding out what works. You do scientific research to figure out what works if we do this, what works if we do that, and then based on that evidence, you revise the policies and the laws.
Exactly. I think in the past that our interventions were more structured by a desire for revenge or just a basic belief that if you punish someone or threaten to punish someone, that it would modify their behavior or modify the choices they made. And what I think people are realizing more and more is that crimes frequently are committed in fits of passion, and people aren't thinking real clearly when they're committing the crimes, and when you lock them up for a long time, you don't do a whole lot to change anyone's behavior.
Right, and you probably weaken their coping skills and take away their ability to learn better decision-making material.
But you know, I think I probably disagree with Stephen on some of this. What I see is with the budget cuts in the prison system, there are hardly any programs left standing. So in terms of keeping people out of prison, we're doing better. In terms of what we do when they're in prison, that is terrible.
Yeah, and I don't think that's a disagreement. I think that's a very appropriate enhancement and additional information.
You know, if we had the kind of failure rate, if you have to think about the recidivism rate as a failure rate of that correctional system to not correct, you know, if we had a 40% rate where you go to the hospital and you have a 40% likelihood of dying from something that happens to you there, you know, not only do they fail to cure you, but they end up killing you. If we had 40% of the patients dying, we'd have a scandal on our hands. Or 40% of the kids that come out of school couldn't read or something, you know. And yet this has been with us for so long in the criminal justice system.
I heard a sociologist say that our prison system is the biggest failed social experiment in history. So I think I tend to agree with that.
Yeah, yeah. And it's hugely expensive. So if people want to,
Hugely expensive.
So I know during the course of this conversation, we'll be talking about what are some cost-effective things that really work and will actually save taxpayers money.
Right.
What are some of the aspects of the prison system that make it so hard for people to turn their lives around and fit back into society?
I think one of our basic problems that we have trouble getting past is the fact that we can't decide what the prison system is for. Is it for rehabilitation? Are we trying to fix people?
Yeah, it
or
used
are
to
we
be.
trying to punish people?
Yeah.
And right now, an acknowledged primary goal of our system is punishment. But if you think about that, if that is your goal, that and incapacitation, it's bound to not work, because either you have to keep everyone in prison or you let out a bunch of angry people with no job skills who have done nothing for years.
Right. And yeah, so what happens if you lock somebody up for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, they come out less capable of functioning, less capable of making good decisions, less capable of taking responsibility, because everything is programmed for them and they're held down and it's a restrictive thing, and we've diminished their human capabilities.
Absolutely. And you know, one of the reasons we started University Beyond Bars was I just started offering classes in the prison and began to realize how the deck is stacked against anyone coming out of prison. We charge them all kinds of fees, court costs, victim payments, and so forth. They're called LFOs, legal financial obligations. While they're in prison, where the most they can make is 42 cents an hour, we charge 12% interest to them on whatever that is. So when they come out of prison, they get $40 gate money, plus they've got a huge debt, many of them, to pay off, and a felony conviction on their record. So the odds of them finding a job and living happily ever after are slim.
But you may have learned in prison how to sell drugs or how to
You may have.
do
You may
some
have
other
improved
things.
some of your skills.
Yeah.
Well, I think, you know, when I think about it, I think the primary purpose of our prisons, at least what we think they exist for, is to make our communities safer places to live and work. And, you know, and the question you have to ask is, are we succeeding in accomplishing that goal? Sometimes we take someone who's, you know, behaving in a way outside of prison that's harming others and lock them up so that they can't do that. But eventually, most of them are, you know, most people who are locked up are released. And if they recidivate, as you say, if they come out of prison and commit another crime, then, you know, we haven't really accomplished a whole lot. And so it has to be you have to look at the whole picture.
Right. I want to talk with you about the probation and parole. I think a lot of times people don't know the difference between those, and we'll be talking about parole a couple times during this hour. Some people who are convicted of crimes are sentenced to probation. So they say, okay, you're guilty, and what we're going to do is we're going to have a system of restrictions and monitoring, so you have to comply with your probation officer, and if you do that for some period of time, then you don't go to prison. And probation is used a lot. For those who are sentenced to prison, we had a system called parole, which has largely gone away. And the parole was where the sentence would be in a range like, okay, we'll sentence you to someplace between 5 to 8 years. And when you get close to 5 years, they'll say, okay, well, you can apply for parole. And if you've had good behavior and if you look like a good prospect for making it on the outside, they can let you out at the early end of that range, and if not, then you go all the way until the maximum. The parole board would figure out, has the person had good behavior, are they a good prospect for doing okay on the outside, largely with this kind of restrictions and monitoring that a probationer would have, in that sense of things. But a lot of states have pretty much eliminated parole, and Washington State eliminated that also in the early 80s, except for those who were sentenced before that time. And so we have what's determinate sentencing is the new term, where you're going to do 20 years and you're just going to do 20 years no matter what.
Right.
Tell us about some of the problems, Stephen, that happened with the parole system. What caused people to abandon that? And then later on we'll talk about
Well,
remedies.
I'd start with what many see as a controversial statement, but one I think is accurate, is that we are a racist society. The three of us up here are white, and when you go down to the legislature, the majority of people are white, and the complexion of the people who run the institutions are not reflective of society as a whole. And inevitably, people behave in ways that are biased against individuals who aren't regularly part of the social groups that they are part of. And as a result, our prison population is dramatically biased or has a disproportionately large number of minorities because they suffer stronger sentences and higher arrest rates and everything else. So there was a belief that they could objectify the process to get around the racism that people acknowledged was part of the system, and that they could come up with determinate sentences, and if you were found to be guilty of crime X, then crime X would generate sentence B. And it would be the same for you as it would be for someone who was African American, as it would be for someone who was Asian American or someone who was Latino American. It would be the same for everybody. Unfortunately, it hasn't worked because while, I guess the other piece of it that I left out was that there was a sense that the parole board was granting parole on a racially biased basis. And so the concept was, well, we'll just do away with parole, we'll have determinate sentencing, the judges will sentence for a shorter period of time because there was a belief that sentences had been increased to accommodate the fact that people would be eventually getting parole, and that it would be the same for everyone. But it hasn't worked because the prosecutor, law enforcement, and through the system behave in ways similar to the ways the parole boards were behaving. And so now we have to step back and say, okay, we haven't succeeded in eliminating the racism from our correction system with determinate sentencing and with the elimination of parole, but we have created a lot of negative things. We've taken away an incentive that used to exist to encourage people to use their time in prison in the most positive ways possible, partly in hope that they would be granted parole. And that goes to some of the stuff that Carol's doing.
Yeah, the good behavior and educational opportunities or other things. What you're describing is similar to what happened with the death penalty at the national level. I do a lot of work on death penalty, working to abolish the death penalty, and in '72, the U.S. Supreme Court threw out the death penalty laws as they existed around the state because they were just so arbitrary and capricious, and they had huge amounts of racial bias because there was not enough clear guidance as to when to impose the death penalty and when not to. So they said, your laws around the country are just all arbitrary and capricious, basically. And they threw it out, and states a few years later started to come up with tighter guidelines. And we still have the same, now a couple decades later, we still have the same problems, but the Supreme Court has changed. And so now the Supreme Court says, well, that's okay. It's okay to have it racially biased in terms of the results as you look at the 3,000 people on death row. So it's the Supreme Court that changed, but the racial discrimination is still the same as it was before.
And I think there was a factor, too, in how the death penalty was administered. But regardless, it's death penalty is another thing that we look at and say, that is it really serving the purposes for which it was designed?
Yeah.
And one thing about the switch that we had in our thinking is we went from a system that focused on the individual. An individual man or woman would go before the parole board, get a chance to make his or her case for, I haven't had any infractions in 30 years, I've gotten my college degree and so forth. What we decided, and I think this is where we're wrong, is we decided that we could create justice by taking the individualism out of this
Right.
scheme. So it's all becomes a matter of statistics and sentencing grids. You have this record, so therefore you fit in
Yeah.
here and you get this sentence. And I think it's going to be an interesting question that we have to ask: is this fair? Is this how you would like to be judged as a person who fits in this square on the grid, or would you like to come before a group and make your own case for you as a person, being different from other people?
I've read about cases where there are some really odd extenuating circumstances, and here's some kid who's 18 or 19 or something, and if you look at what that case is about, you'd realize they should not be sentenced to that, whatever that extreme thing was, because of these extenuating circumstances, and the judges don't have any discretion.
That's right.
And they have to do this. And I've read a number of cases where the judge just really writes these anguished things, saying, I hate having to do this. This is just not fair. It's not just. It's not real justice. But the law requires me to sentence you to blah, 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 blah.
And another thing that's a real heartbreaker is what often happens, like it's happened with 3 strikes. At first,
And that's the thing where if you get 3 felony convictions of certain kinds, you get a mandatory life sentence.
Yes, 777 years. And with
Not life.
several lives.
Yeah, Methuselah could have made it.
Right, but what happens is with this, for example, the prosecutors thought at first that if a person committed one of these crimes that's on this list, and Washington has, if not the largest, one of the longest lists of strike crimes of any state, if you committed something on this list, they had to charge it as a strike. So early on in this process, a lot of people went to jail there are 3 strikers who are supposed to be worst of the worst. That's what we voted for when we voted for that law, in there for 3 nonviolent crimes like purse snatching. And they go in as 19-year-old and never come out again. And so this changes. They don't really do that anymore with 3 strikes. Yet here are these guys sitting in prison still.
So that 3 strikes thing is one of the things that's been happening with longer sentences. We've got Washington State was the first law that passed a 3 strikes bill by initiative, and then I think about 24 other states or thereabouts had copied and done the same. There's also been this huge growth of crimes with sentences of life, and many of those are life without parole. Some research I did recently showed that in the United States, more than 127,000 people were serving life sentences in state or federal prisons, more than 127,000. And about a fourth of those, 33,000 persons, were serving sentences of life without parole. And in the 11-year period from 1992 to 2003, the number of lifers almost doubled. It was like 85% or something increase. And that was because the laws required these long sentences, these life sentences. There was not an increase in crime. In fact, during that time, the crime rate was dropping. But they were imposing these. What can you tell us about these longer sentences and about life without parole, life sentences and life without parole in particular?
I see a lot of men with sentence of life without parole. In our program, it was, the prison was originally a closed custody prison, so that means that people there had long sentences. So I've known many, many men with these sentences, and they consider it death by incarceration, death by another name. It's a sentence of you will die in prison. And like all these new sentencing inventions, they were really enthusiastic about it at first, and they started giving it to all these young kids. And under our current system, There's no review ever. You can be angelic in prison for 40 years and no one will ever look at you again. And it's such a hopeless, cruel thing to do to someone. Mm-hmm. But it's a real dilemma because, you know, when you're working on abolishing the death penalty, the first thing you do is try to say, well, we'll just put him in prison for a sentence of life without the possibility of parole. So that raises a problem for the folks working on that, because it's a harsh sentence.
When I was talking with one of you to prepare for the program, talking on the phone, one of you had said that the intention or the assumption was that clemency would be, I think you might have been the one that said that clemency, which is a way of having some compassionate judgment to reduce a sentence, might be a factor, and that hasn't worked out?
No, the clemency system, I was told by one of the people who worked on this law, David Berner, who is the head of the Sentencing Guidelines Commission, was saying when they worked on getting a determinate sentencing law, they felt that the clemency system would be the pressure release valve that parole had been. Well, it doesn't work for a lot of reasons. One is that it's very hard to do it and succeed without a lawyer. A lawyer to do a clemency petition costs around $25,000. Almost no one in prison has $25,000, so it means it's selecting for people with money already, and the governor gives out 5 or 6 out of a prison population of 18,000.
But
so
what's more significant, I think, is out of how many that the Clemency Board recommends. So if the governor doesn't follow the Clemency Board's recommendations.
That's another, yeah.
I read about that in other states as well, where even if the Clemency Board does its job and thinks things through and shows some reason, the governor, who's elected needs to be tough on crime, and they don't dare run the risk of...
they potentially suffer negative voter affinity if they just release people who are incarcerated. And if they release someone who actually goes out and then commits another crime, their political career can be at an end. And so in order to do all the other things that they could do as governor, they say, well, I'm just going to have to set this one aside. And the result is we've got a pressure cooker with no release valve.
Right. We need to educate the public, like through this TV program, to help people think through the stuff better.
Think through the stuff better in order to create a different structure, because the one we have isn't working.
Tell us something, Stephen, about the war on drugs. A lot of the increase in the prison population came about because of the, quote, war on drugs, which hasn't worked, by the way. Tell us about the war on drugs and prisons.
Well, my experience in the Washington State Legislature and listening to people representing prosecutors and law enforcement is that they are of the belief that very few people are actually serving time as a direct result of possessing small amounts of controlled substances. What I hear them saying over and over again is that if they are convicted for possession, it's as a result of a plea bargain. And the intimation is that they're arrested for a more heinous crime. It's cost the state less to do a plea bargain and incarcerate them for the lower level crime that was also part of their arrest, and that's why they're in prison. I don't know whether that's accurate or not. I've not done the research to confirm or refute it, but that's what I hear.
What would be a better way to approach the issue of drug use? I mean, I keep thinking, and other people who work the issue say, this is a public health matter. There's no point to have it be a criminal matter. Other, European countries have a better sense in general about treating it as a public health matter.
Well, and I think to your point, whether people are being directly arrested and convicted for possession, or whether it's only happening as a sort of en route to deal with a more heinous crime, the bottom line is it is a public health issue and a personal health issue, and our money is better invested in treating people with drug abuse problems so that those problems are addressed. And in fact, we are doing that we're doing that a lot with juveniles. And you know, the Senate Human Services and Corrections Committee has done a study that they used information from the Washington State Institute of Public Policy to document that $180 million that's been invested in preventative interventions has reduced the state prison population by a number sufficient to generate $1 billion in savings, and or no, $2 billion in savings, and close to $5 billion in avoided victim costs.
So in some European countries, they've looked at heroin or other things from a harm reduction approach, which seems to make a lot of sense. So the idea is, okay, if somebody's going to use something, let's find ways that their drug use won't cause as much damage as it is now. So if all three of us are addicts and we're all using the same needle, if somebody has the HIV, we all end up with that. Well, that's going to cost us a lot of money as a society. And so the free needle exchange program makes sense because fewer people will get AIDS. But then some people say, oh, no, we don't want to be giving needles to addicts.
You're encouraging it.
Yeah, as if it's encouraging it. It's not. If the three of us are addicted, we're addicted. But we'd be better off as a society if we don't have additional AIDS, people with AIDS. So it's the harm reduction is a whole better approach.
And I think it's probably true that we're not incarcerating as many people for just possession, but the number of people in prison for possession or for drug-related things is enormous.
Yeah. So if I burglarize some houses to get money to steal stuff to sell to feed my habit, it's drug-related, even though I'm not in prison directly for the drug.
And they say it's 80 or 90% of the crimes committed that lead people into prison are drug and alcohol related. So in some way, you could be a drug dealer, of course, and it would be drug related. But
a lot of the burglaries or
a lot of people in prison because they were addicts, and then they did something as a result.
Yeah, forged some checks or did whatever. Well, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, Stephen mentioned something that I thought was really important for us to understand. There are two things that people don't understand about the prison system. I think the average person, I didn't understand. The first is that we don't have parole. Everyone in the state that you ask, unless they've got someone in prison, says, oh, he'll be out on parole. No, he won't. There's no parole. And the second thing is, well, in our justice system, at least you get a fair trial. You don't get a fair trial. I mean, you may get a fair one if you get one, but 85 or 90% of people go to prison without ever having had a trial. The system runs on plea bargains. And people think, oh, he pled because he's guilty. But if you don't accept a deal, charges are added to your problems. So if you go to court, you're basically punished for going to trial. And I didn't know that the system worked like that. I thought people got trials, and so that disturbs me a lot.
I've heard people say that folks could crash the system if everybody demanded a trial instead of don't plead. Don't do it. Don't accept a plea bargain. Demand a trial, and you'd crash the system. Anyway, what are some of the values? We talked about some specifics, and there have been implicit in this some values that we may hold. What values guide your thinking about what the criminal justice system should be doing, or how we should handle issues of crime or social behavior?
Well, one of the things that Friends Committee on Washington Public Policy starts with is, how to remedy damage that victims suffer, and then to look at crime in the context of the community. and a crime is an individual is basically doing something to harm someone else who's in their same community, but they still, share the same community. So one of the things that come out of that for Friends Committee on Washington Public Policy and Quakers in general is a program that's called Restorative Justice.
Yeah, and it comes out of other traditions that's heavily used in by the Mennonite church, people with a Mennonite church background. In some areas of Canada, restorative justice is very much widespread, especially the areas that have a lot of Mennonites.
Well, not just from religious communities, but in Canada and much of the rest of the world, it's part of their judicial system and their correction system.
Right, but I'm saying there's a lot of the emphasis in organizing restorative justice programs has come from Mennonites. A lot of the big researchers, Howard Zare and others, are come out of Mennonite background.
Yeah, you're correct. So a concept that instead of trying to prevent future behavior of a similar nature in which one person is harming another by punishing the individual who is perceived to have done the harm, that you bring everyone together and sit down and make sure the person who has done the harm understands what he or she has done. When a victim is willing and able to have that person directly confront person who has committed a crime and inform him or her, this is how I've been damaged, and so that the person who's done the crime really understands it, because a lot of criminal acts are committed by people, again, without a whole lot of forethought and without a whole lot of afterthought. They don't understand the damage that they've actually done. And a lot of studies have shown that if you can help people understand the impact of their actions in a very real way, that does a whole lot to minimize the potential of them committing similar acts in the future.
Yeah, one of the things you said at the very beginning of this conversation about restorative justice is that it pays attention to the victims as well as the offenders. And the current system that we have pretty much just ignores the victims unless they need somebody to testify as a witness. But they otherwise get kind of shunted aside, and then the state grinds on through its process. And one of the things I like about restorative justice is that it tries to make the victim whole again and reintegrate everybody into communities. So a crime is evidence of a brokenness of community. And so if the offender can be held accountable, but not through just punishment, but through the kind of thing you're suggesting, or some way of making restitution or working things out, the victim becomes a real person again, because they may get whatever in exchange, or at least they're heard in a more profound way, and the offender is also valued as a person and restored. In some African communities, they have a process where they gather in a circle in the village, and they'll talk it through, and the person who otherwise would have been shunned or exiled is restored to the community, and you've rebuilt those community bonds again. And that's a whole different process from an adversarial judicial system where it's the state versus Stephen, or
I have been thinking about the victim issue a lot, and I have a little bit different perspective. From my years in the legislature, I found that the myth that no one pays attention to the victim that has changed a lot from 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah. And now the victims groups have powerful lobbies, and legislators will pretty much not do anything that the victims groups oppose. And so I think another difficult question we have to consider is, what should the role of the victims be in our criminal justice system? To what extent do they get to decide the penalty? should. I can think of 1-3 Striker who was in prison for a purse snatching. His victim didn't want him to ever get out of prison. And, so what I think the state should be playing the role of rational moderator, because the victim has been harmed and we should do everything we can to make that better. But they don't get to decide. I don't think they should get to decide the penalty when somebody gets out of jail or anything like that.
That becomes excessive.
Oh, and could I say one more thing about victims? An interesting thing, too, is who are the victims? We tend to think the perpetrators are in prison and the victims are out here. But it's a very fuzzy line between the two. In one of my classes, I was teaching a writing class with about 12 guys, and I said, someone was writing about being shot, and I said, oh my gosh, how many of you have been shot? And everyone in the class had been shot. Yeah. And so we started talking about this a little bit. People have had their family members murdered, they even shot themselves, all these things that would make you a victim, yet here you are in prison. So a lot of the times, victims are in prison too. And it's not that inside-outside line, and we just need to expand our thinking a little bit.
Yeah, a lot of these things need more thoughtful analysis.
More gray area.
Nuances and things. See?
So if we could intervene at an earlier stage in a more proactive and productive manner, which I think, going back again to some of the things that were documented by the study I referred to.
Yes.
It's being done. So giving, Carol's 100% correct that people who commit crimes at some time in their life, much more so than people who aren't committing crimes, at some point in their lives, as a person we've labeled criminal is highly likely to have been a victim.
Right.
And that is part of the process that creates a criminal.
Yeah. Well, it brings to mind what you hear about people who molest children. Very often have been the victims of having been molested at an earlier age, or child abusers.
Absolutely.
Or, some of these things cycle, and so it's more
and
complex.
that is a very tough argument to make. As Stephen knows, I'm sure, over in the legislature, it's like, oh, the poor criminals. Nobody buys that, but it is often, there's often some grisly history for them.
Yeah. Let's talk for just a bit about each of the organizations that you work with. You're with the Friends Committee on Washington Public Policy, and it's a great organization. I've appreciated donating to your group for a number of years. Yeah. But I appreciate the way your group, as well as so many others, and you used to lobby for them in the past, approaches the issues in this thoughtful, well-informed way, and with credibility and honesty. And we should mention that they're at www.fcwpp.org, and we call it FCWIP, but it's fcwpp.org. Tell us just a bit about FCWIP.
Well, Friends Committee on Washington Public Policy.
And Friends is a name for the Quakers. The
Quakers was the name for the Friends.
Yeah, so it's
so in the 1650s, a group of people in northern England formed a religious society that they named Society of Friends of Truth. Interesting from our perspective now today is in a judiciary process in which one of the founders, George Fox, was being tried. They got into an argument with the judge about who was being, who was quaking in fear of God. And somehow that became a popular term for referencing for members of the Society of Friends of Truth, became Quakers more commonly than Friends.
So I just want people to understand that's where the Friends is in the organizational name and in the religious denomination name.
And, so Quakers for centuries have been involved in trying to, create the kingdom of God on earth. as many believe we are encouraged to do by statements in the New Testament that are said to originate with Jesus. So here we are. And one of the things that Quakers have worked hard on is prison reform, in part because in the 17th century many Quakers were in prison, in English prisons, because there were laws that said you had to tithe to the state church. And Quakers said, well, we don't think we should have to do that, and we're not going to do that. Quakers later said we're not going to fight in wars, and that would sometimes end up in incarceration. And so Quakers were invested and are invested to make prisons places that are more humane. We're also invested in seeing effective modes of intervention. And like one of the things that I hadn't realized, or should have, but hadn't realized as concretely, is when William Penn was rewriting the penal code for Pennsylvania and limiting the number of crimes for which one could be convicted to death. He took committing a homosexual act off of the list. So we put marriage equality in our economic justice bailiwick, but it seems it's also a criminal justice issue.
Quakers are very often way ahead of the curve on things. Let's thank you. Carol, tell us something about Universities Beyond Bars. What a great name.
Thank you. Well, it started about 12 years ago when I and a friend of mine, Gary Eidelberg, went out to Washington State Reformatory. I was the editor of Yes magazine at the time, one of the editors, and we were doing an issue on called "Is It Time to Close the Prisons?" And I went out there just thinking, I'm going to just be a voyeur, a fly on the wall, and see what it's like out there, and then write it up and be done with it. And going out there was a life-changing experience. The people in prison were not who I thought they'd be. They were polite and funny and terrific, and they asked me to come back. And so I decided to do a creative writing class, and that morphed into doing college classes out there. So now we have about 150 students, and we're offering 20 classes, and we were providing college credit through Ohio University. We don't have the budget to do that right now, which is sad because a lot of men are getting close, and a lot of men have earned associate's degrees through us. And so higher education is the single most effective way to reduce recidivism, and that was one reason that we decided to try to do that. And so.
And people can contact you folks. You're based in Poulsbo in Kitsap
Yes,
County.
that's where I live. Yes.
And the website is www.universitybeyondbars.org.
Right, easy
that's
to remember.
Great. And I went to the website, and I appreciated the mission statement, the vision statement, the goals, and the values. It's just, and I read through the listing of the course offerings. And
oh, great! Thank you.
It looks like a great operation there. Probably in need of money.
Oh yes, in need of money.
Yeah. So if when like you mentioned earlier, this research that had shown how some things actually are cost effective in reducing crime, especially going from the juvenile to the adult level, and you talked about education, post-secondary education, college level, as being powerful.
And you should see the change of culture in the prison that happens when these people who never thought they were college material start. We've got guys working on Calculus 2 now who started with us with fractions. And I couldn't do Calculus 2 if my life depended on it, but these guys are doing that. They went physics. It's really motivating and exciting.
So all kinds of integration occurring.
Yeah.
Yes. So part of what we need to do with the system is have some way to get people reintegrated into society. And we've talked about this earlier in the conversation, where if you're in for some sentence, even if it's a long sentence, unless you're a lifer, you're going to get out at some point, and then what happens? And after you've been debilitated by that experience of having, years of dehumanization, how are you going to cope on the outside? And it seems like our society has done some things that make it even worse for a person to get back on their feet. And like you said, you end up with a felony record, then who's going to hire you?
Right.
And if you need to get back on your feet and you need a place to live and you're not eligible for public housing because you have a felony record, and you need some food but you can't qualify for food stamps because you have a felony record, and on and on. Well, well, I know how to deal drugs, I'll go back to that again.
Exactly.
Or I know how to burglarize houses, I'll go back to that again. Or forge checks or whatever it is. And it seems like we need to lower those barriers so people can actually reintegrate. And I know FICWIP and a bunch of other good groups, ACLU of Washington and others, have worked to get laws so that people can register to vote again.
Yes.
And I mean, these things we need to, you talked about this on the phone. The importance of
there's something exciting in the works right now, and that is this parole bill that's 2521 right now. It'll probably get a new number, but they're proposing bringing back parole. But what they're trying to do is have the parole board, connect up the guys who they're releasing with community support groups that will sort of take them under their wing and help them get identification.
So
and all
little
those
bit of
things.
casework, case management, transition.
It's exciting because we're welcoming these people back in that way, instead of saying, don't live near me. We're saying, come on back, we'll help you get on your feet.
Well, one of the groups that is part of the Fellowship of Reconciliation is based in the Puget Sound area. Justice Works, and it deals with these issues, especially regarding African American folks. And they do a monthly welcome back gathering. It's a welcome back celebration. So you come out, and you've got people who are happy to see you.
Right.
And so just even getting past the anonymity of it all these things are needed.
Well, having a network of people who will help and support you. I mean, that's really, most of us, our success relies on the relationships we have with family members, with instructors, with employers, past employers. If you come out of prison and you don't have that, and you have all these labels that make people shy away from you, and you feel alienated in part because you can't vote, which is a big part of what, you raised that in a minute ago. And one of the reasons the Friends Committee on Washington Public Policy has advocated for restoration of voting rights similar to what exists in the state of Maine, and I think in at least one or two other states in the country, is that when we alienate people, we again increase the probability that they will commit crimes.
People have to get reintegrated and reconnected, and that makes us all a safer society.
And we used to think of it this way. We used to think, okay, he's paid his debt to society. Give the guy a chance, and tie a yellow ribbon on the oak tree and all that. And we have just gotten so scared. We're so scared of everybody now. Much different than when I was a kid. And the fact that it once existed, that we once said, okay, your debt is paid, welcome home, I think, to me, says we can do that again.
We have a different kind of politics. We have a kind of a politics of meanness.
We do.
And we need to get back to this more humane. You've talked, Stephen, about the futility of prisons, of the futility of incarcerating people. I don't know if you use the term futility, but the sense that at some very fundamental level, this whole notion of prisons is just a bad model.
It's a bad model for many of the people who get imprisoned. And, I speculate that there are many people whom we wouldn't want outside of prisons, but we have a whole lot of people who are incarcerated, and we're going to release them, and they're going to come back into our communities, back into their communities. And, the question is, are they going to have benefited in ways that make them less likely to commit future crimes? Are they going to benefit in ways that allow them to contribute to the communities of which they are part? And are they going to benefit from ways that allow them to reintegrate and become part of the family and the community in a productive manner? Or are they going to be isolated and continue to suffer from the poor decision-making processes that led to the crises that led to the choices to commit the original crimes?
Yeah, it seems like people who have bad coping skills, people who don't know how to handle conflicts. If you and I are disagreeing with something and our solution is to punch each other out, that's not a good conflict resolution method. And it just seems like people end up in prison because, I shot you out of anger because I didn't know how to work through the problem that we were grappling with. It seems like if we could have more of these things on the outside, and certainly by the time somebody commits a crime, help them learn how to deal with anger, help them learn how to solve conflicts, coping skills. A lot of times people, I think, do stuff because they feel powerless. If I'm a kid and I feel like the world of grown-ups is stacked against me and I'm only a kid and I'm looked down on, maybe I can gain some power by taking a baseball bat and beating up the mailboxes in the neighborhood. And it's a sense of a little bit of a rush of empowerment. And then the juvenile system slaps me down and grinds me through a bureaucratic process. I'm disempowered. But when I get out, I'm going to go out and bash mailboxes again because I need that rush. We need to deal with people's coping skills and people's needs and stuff. It's not a soft, touchy-feely thing. It's practical.
Right. And that's, we talked about restorative justice, and those are the kinds of things that can come out of restorative justice conferences. And you say, well, to remedy the damage that, you've done to your victim, you need to get a handle on anger management. And to do that, you need to go take these classes, or you need to, you were under the influence of alcohol or something else when you made the decision that resulted in the action that caused the harm of the victim, and you could say, as part of the contract that comes out of the Restorative Justice Conference, get the alcohol abuse treated, get the substance abuse treated. And that's a very cost-effective way of intervening.
And a case-by-case justice, not a cookie-cutter, one-size-fits-all thing. Carol, you had...
I was just going to say that this kind of dovetails with the new focus on juvenile brain development.
Oh, yes.
And of course, the Supreme Court recently used that science, which tells us that young people's brains aren't fully developed until they're around 25. And so they use that to say that the mandatory life without sentence for juveniles is unconstitutional. But what that brain science is that I think is really interesting, it's partly about risks that young men in particular take. They just have this biological drive to take risks, to do wild things. And so on the one end of the spectrum...
Without the full cognitive sense of what it's
things that
about.
happen later that make you say, oh, are you kidding me?
Totally, I think.
Yeah. And so we got this group of people who are in prison, and we wonder, should we have done that? Then on the other end of the spectrum, beyond age 35, they say people age out of crime. So you're very unlikely, more and more unlikely to commit crime. So we could save ourselves a lot of money and a lot of grief if we look at those two groups and say, do they really need to be in here?
Yeah, we're getting a very geriatric prison populations.
We sure are.
A lot of these people, they're in their 60s, 70s, 80s.
There are people out there on walkers.
It's amazing. We're wrapping up pretty soon here.
Okay.
I want to check in and ask us to reflect on what kind of society we want to live in. The society needs to make a choice and not just be driven by politicians that need to be tough on crime so they can get elected. I would hope that people in society would actively think about, what kind of society do we want to live in? I want to just get a couple ideas from each of you about that.
Yeah. Well, I suspect that whether you're trying to create the society by getting tough on crime, or whether you're trying to create a better society by treating individuals with mental health and substance abuse issues and providing increased job opportunities, that ultimately we're all looking for a very similar society. And, it's one in which everyone cares for each other, where people feel safe, where there's opportunity for everybody, and where we come in conflict is how we go about creating that society. Right. And the challenge is, do we sit down and use evidence-based approaches, do careful study of the different interventions that we're using, determine whether they're achieving the goals that we've defined? Have we properly defined the goals?
Okay.
The last thing I would say is, we mentioned geriatric individuals and older people who are incarcerated. We're spending a whole lot of money keeping people in prison who objectively we know are very unlikely to commit crimes because they're old and not going to do that.
We're very tight on time. I want to just ask you for a brief thing about the kind of society you want.
The kind of society I would like to live in is a more generous society, where we are generous to each other with a helping hand.
Great, thanks. Well, I know there are a lot of good remedies, a lot of good recommendations that you've offered based on the kinds of work you're doing for more substantive education, all kinds of other services, changes in the laws and public policy and things. And I do want to encourage people again to check out both of the organizations that you work with, the Friends Committee on Washington Public Policy at
fwccp.org.
I could say FICWIP, because you would have to spell it out. I have to get that right sequence, fcwpp.org, and universitybeyondbars.org.
Right.
So those are both great. And there's some other good groups. The ACLU of Washington has done good work. Faith Action Network, which is the new name for the combination of Washington Association of Churches and Lutheran Public Policy Office. They've done good work, and a bunch of other groups. Justice Works that I mentioned. So I want to thank Carol Estes, and I want to thank Stephen Aldrich. I want to thank all the folks who've been watching. Many people have observed that a good way to judge society is by how it treats the people at the bottom of that society. And people in prison are at the bottom of our society. A lot of people want to grind them further into the dirt and diminish their humanity, but what happens when they get out of prison? And society is going to reap what it has sown. Our contempt for them as a society will flow back upon us in sort of a bad karma turnaround. The moral and sensible thing to do would be to break that cycle and to restore everyone's full humanity. Make sure the victims are taken care of, make sure offenders get rehumanized, get their needs taken care of, and get reintegrated into society to live healthy and productive lives. If we want to live in a decent society, we have to treat every person with decency, including those who have made mistakes. Our criminal justice system is not only dysfunctional, it's counterproductive. It makes things worse in many ways. We need to do a lot of reforms. And I encourage folks to contact the Friends Committee for Washington Public Policy at ficwip.org and University Beyond Bars at universitybeyondbars.org. The Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation TV program has produced other programs in the past on these topics about 3 strikes, about death penalty, featuring the Set Up to Fail play produced by Justice Works. And you can watch them through the Olympia FOR's website, olympiafor.org. You can get information about a lot of issues that relate to peace, social justice, and nonviolence by contacting the Olympia Fellowship of Reconciliation at 360-491-9093, www.olympiafor.org. We're all one human family. We all share one planet. We can make the world a better place, but we all have to do our part, and the world needs what you have to offer. Thanks.